Forevermore. It was a feeling, really. A feeling that surpassed their expectations. A feeling that led to that moment. The moment where they were side by side, the heart monitors softly beeping. Casey's eyes were fixed on the window, where the orange glow of sunset spilled across the room. Joe's gaze, however, lingered on Casey. She admired the way Casey stared out into the world with a peacefulness that had taken years to grow into. The photograph on the nightstand caught the warm light. Their wedding day, still as vivid as the moment it was taken. She felt at peace. Casey felt loved. Emotions were like the ocean, pulling them into depths that sometimes felt too vast, too full. But today there was only calm, a steady rhythmic tide. They were full. Content. Even as the machines quietly reminded them that their time was coming to a close. "How long has it been?" Joe asked softly, not taking her eyes off Casey. Casey didn't immediately answer, lost in thought. The question hung in the air, like an echo from their youth. So many years had passed since they first met. High school sweethearts who had grown into something much deeper. 70 years together. And yet, it always felt like they were discovering new pieces of themselves. "Not long enough," Casey finally whispered, voice raspy but full of affection. The sunset painted the room in hues of gold, casting long shadows over their tired bodies. Joe smiled at the reply, her heart swelling. She turned her head to look at the picture beside them, both of them standing young and carefree, holding hands on a warm summer day. Joe in a soft white dress, Casey in a tailored suit. That day had been the start of something beautiful, something neither of them could have fully understood at the time. "Maybe it's been just long enough," Joe murmured, her voice tender. Casey's eyes welled with tears at the words. "Remember the garden we planted in your mom's backyard?" Joe asked, her smile growing a little wider at the memory. Casey chuckled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Back when she didn't approve of us? She was so stubborn," Joe laughed lightly. "Took her years to come around." "That she did," Casey agreed, wiping at her eyes, though the tears kept coming. "But it didn't matter, did it? We built a life anyway." The laugh lines on Casey's face deepened. The years of joy and sorrow etched into every crease. They had faced every obstacle together. Homophobic family members, the challenge of carving out their place in a world that didn't always accept them, the fights, the reconciliations. And yet, through it all, they had remained each other's constant. Their friends from those early years were gone now. Family too. But the two of them? They had stayed. And that was more than enough. It was comforting, knowing they had weathered all of life's storms together and come out stronger. "Can I ask you something?" Casey's voice was soft, a little shaky, as she finally looked away from the sunset to meet Joe's eyes. Joe smiled, the same bright grin that had always made Casey's heart race. "You can ask me anything." Casey held Joe's gaze for a long moment before speaking. "If you could go back and change anything, would you?" Joe didn't hesitate, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. "I'd find you sooner." That was all it took. The dam broke and Casey couldn't hold back the sobs any longer. They'd known each other for most of their lives. Since they were just teenagers awkwardly trying to figure out how to love each other in a world that wasn't ready for them. And now, here they were, together at the end with only a few hours or days left. But they were together. That was what mattered. It was what had always mattered. Casey reached for Joe's hand, the pulse oximeter beeping quietly as their fingers intertwined. Even after all these years, that simple touch still made Casey's heart flutter. The love was still there, as strong and alive as it had ever been. They didn't need to say the words. The love between them was always felt, always understood. The way their hands fit together, the way they looked at each other. It said more than words ever could. In that quiet moment, as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Casey realized there was something else she felt. Something she hadn't known was possible, even after all their years together. It wasn't just love. It wasn't just gratitude or joy. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was a sense of completion. For so long, Casey had worried she wasn't worthy of the kind of love Joe had given her. But through Joe, she had come to realize that she was. They had built a life, a beautiful life, filled with love, and now as they neared the end of that journey, Casey felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. If there was a next life, they would find each other again. Of that Casey was sure. But for now, this moment, this beautiful, quiet moment was all that mattered. Together, as they had always been, and always would be. As the sun sank lower, casting a soft purple hue across the hospital room, the air between Casey and Joe thickened with memories. Their hands still intertwined, Joe gently traced her thumb along Casey's wrinkled knuckles, her mind drifting back to all the milestones they'd shared. The years had sped by like a river rushing too fast to hold on to. But every moment was imprinted in Joe's heart. "Remember the day we finally left Washington?" Joe asked, a soft smile forming on her lips. "I don't think I've ever seen you drive that fast in my life." Casey let out a chuckle, her breath shallow but steady. "How could I forget? We were running like fugitives, but I've never felt more free." They had been just 21 at the time, barely adults and already defying the expectations laid out for them by their families, their community. Leaving the reservation had been Joe's decision, but Casey had supported her without question. Neither of their families had understood why they wanted to be together, much less why they felt they needed to leave their lives behind. But together, they had packed up a tiny beat-up car and drove all the way to California. "You insisted on stopping at that diner in Oregon, remember?" Joe said, her grin growing wider. "You swore the milkshakes there were the best in the world." "And I was right," Casey replied, a mischievous twinkle in her eye despite the fatigue that hung over her. "You even admitted it." Joe shook her head, laughing softly. "Yeah, I did. But that wasn't why we stopped. You just wanted to make sure I was okay. I was scared, you know? Scared of what we were leaving behind." Casey squeezed her hand tighter, her voice lowering. "I knew you were scared. I was too. But we made it, didn't we?" "We did." Joe's voice softened, and for a moment, she was back there again, sitting in that old car with Casey, watching the world blur by as they built a new life together, mile by mile. California had been the first step. It was there that they had found a small apartment, scraping by with odd jobs and the few belongings they had brought with them. Life wasn't easy at first, but it was theirs. And for Joe, that had made all the difference. It had taken time for them to figure things out, what they wanted, who they wanted to be. But they did it together. "I remember us sitting on the beach that first summer," Casey whispered, her voice fading into the sound of the heart monitors. "Just staring at the waves, not knowing what the future would hold." "You held my hand that day too," Joe said, "and told me we'd figure it out." "And we did." Casey's eyes fluttered, the exhaustion settling deeper into her bones. But she wasn't ready to let go of the conversation just yet. She fought to keep her eyes open, wanting to hold on to every second she had left with Joe. There was still so much to say, even if they had already said it all 1,000 times over the years. "Joe," Casey whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "you've always been stronger than me, you know that?" Joe's breath caught in her throat. "That's not true." "It is." Casey's eyes gleamed with love, even as her strength waned. "You were the one who made all the hard choices. The one who always knew when it was time to push forward, even when I couldn't see the way. Jo shook her head, trying to keep the tears from spilling over. We did it together. Everything. I couldn't have done any of it without you. Casey gave a small smile, one that spoke of a lifetime's worth of love. Maybe. But you were always the brave one. Jo leaned in closer, bringing their hands to her lips as she pressed a kiss to Casey's knuckles. The silence between them was filled with unspoken words, all the things they had endured and triumphed over together. Jo wanted to argue, to tell Casey that she had been just as strong, just as brave. But the words got stuck in her throat, lost in the flood of emotion that surged through her. They sat like that for a long while, the room growing dimmer as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. The hospital had become quieter, too, the hustle of nurses and doctors fading into the background. All that was left was the two of them, in their little bubble, just as they had been when they first ran away to be together all those years ago. Jo's mind wandered to all the moments they had lived through, so many firsts. Their first apartment, the first time they adopted a stray dog together, the first time they stood in front of a courthouse in San Francisco, finally able to get married. You remember our wedding day? Jo asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Casey's face lit up at the memory. Of course. It was raining, but you insisted it didn't matter. You were right. Jo chuckled softly. We were soaked by the time we got to the car. But I didn't care. I was married to you. That was all that mattered. Casey smiled, but her breathing had grown more labored, her chest rising and falling with more difficulty. Jo could feel the shift, could sense the weight of time pressing down on them. Jo. Casey's voice was faint, almost a whisper now. I'm tired. Jo's heart clenched. She knew what Casey meant. She had been preparing for this moment, but nothing could have truly readied her for it. I know, Jo whispered back, her voice breaking as she held Casey's hand tighter. It's okay. I'm here. I'm always here. A tear slipped down Casey's cheek as her breathing slowed. Jo leaned in, her forehead resting against Casey's, their breaths mingling in the quiet space between them. I'll find you again, Jo whispered. In the next life. I promise. Casey's lips curled into a faint smile, her eyes closing as the last bit of sunlight faded from the room. And with that, they let go together just as they had always been. Forevermore.